Good evening, good morning to wherever you are in the world. I want to thank you all for making your way to my infographic presentation. Today I will be covering the broad topic of ethics of punishment and corrections. This presentation was produced exclusively for my criminal justice ethics class, CJUS 421. But before we begin, for those of you who do not know me, my name is Christopher Allen. I have a military background and I am currently a federal security contractor for the Department of Homeland Security, Federal Protective Services. I am also currently studying political science and criminal justice here at MSU Billings. I would like to take a brief portion of your time to discuss whether our current trend of crime and punishment is fair and just. As you can see, my wonderful infographic I've put together for you, my title is Current Trends in Crime and Punishment Fair and Just, and the implications on wider society. So before we begin, I'd like to establish some formal definitions for you, and we need to discuss what is common forms of punishment and what exactly constitutes a crime. According to Cornell Law School, the definition of a crime is as follows: behavior that the law makes punishable as a public offense. So, it's a pretty simple definition that's coming from Cornell Law School, and, we tend to make things more difficult than they need to be and make it more complicated, but with the simple fact of this presentation, that's exactly how crime will be defined. According to Matarini, a punishment consists of intentionally inflicting pain and inflicting a person with suffering and deprivation. So, in a criminal justice system, to have a criminal justice system, we need to be able to describe what constitutes a crime, while also determining the consequences or the punishment for that crime. The one thing I will not be covering in this presentation is capital punishment. Capital punishment is only reserved for the most heinous and premeditated and serial murder crimes, things of that nature. So, in essence, they are very rare, and so that's something I will not be covering today. One thing that's also interesting is what the U.S. Department of Justice's position is on criminal law, and it states that individual states provide a basis upon which judges are able to ascertain appropriate punishment for offenders. And so the federal government, because of the enumerated powers of the Constitution and the separation of powers, this specific function actually falls to the state. Moving on, we want to take a look at here at the data published from the National Institute of Justice. So what this data shows us, if you look there at the pie chart there, the red and the blue, is that the blue shows that 60% of offenders do not reoffend within the first year. And this is kind of critical to the question of the ethical punishment. Is this punishment achieving its goal of altering behavior and reforming offenders? The evidence, long-term evidence, is a little better for this than the 1 year rate. But what we can tell, though, is that there is still a large portion of the ex-prisoner population that is still reoffending and then re-entering the system. 40% is quite a number, but the argument that it is completely ineffective is also disingenuous. So there's obviously things the system could do a lot better. There's no argument there. But from a utilitarian perspective, with the results of this of what our current policy is, it is somewhat achieving its goal. But as I stated earlier, it could definitely use some work. One of the issues that comes up when we're discussing the nature of crime and punishment is whether there's systemic bias in the system in terms of the sentences that are handed out. And so, for the incarceration rate for the United States, according to Wakersfield and Eugen, the graph above will show us the incarceration rate among U.S. adults compared to just the whole population of adults in the U.S., the African American adults, and of course the African American male. According to the data, 7%, a little bit more than 7% of American adults have ever been incarcerated or been a prisoner. According to the data, African American adults are roughly 20 to 21% of all their population has been incarcerated, and black male stands at the highest at roughly 33.5%. And so what this kind of shows us is that, at least from the first graph here we're looking at, that maybe there is some bias somewhere. And so that's something we're going to have to take a look at. So moving on, we look at the U.S. demographic population breakdown and kind of what we're looking at here. So this is the total population in the United States broken up by racial group. And so the data on this is interesting. So, for the white there, unfortunately, the numbers did not make it onto this infographic. I'm not really sure why, but whites make up about 61% of the population. Hispanics are about 18%, and black is roughly 13%. And so, proportion to population, if you consider that 21% of all African American adults, which obviously all population includes both male and female, we have about 7% more representation for the rate of incarceration compared to the demographic and population. Now, the disparity, some would argue, is signs of discrimination. However, I caution the immediate damnation of our system. 7% is not a particularly large variation. So if we look at what the U.S. has locked people up for, I printed this wonderful chart from Prison Policy Initiative, and so it gives a nice pie chart breakdown of the specific things that people are imprisoned for, as well as where they're located. So it's a unique pie graph in the sense that it works its way from center out. So it shows you, for example, that 1.291 million people are imprisoned in state prisons, and overwhelmingly people in state prisons are serving time for violent crime. There's been claims that African American men have been locked up for drug offenses, and surely that is true. But the vast majority of people that are serving prison time in state prisons are violent offenders. And so, they more than likely belong in prison and not out there hurting everybody else. So this data is really complicated because if we move on to the FBI's Unified Crime Report 2019, it shows that black Americans actually accounted for a majority of the homicides. When we adjust for the portion of population, it does actually appear to fairly correlate well with the graph below that shows the incarceration proportion that blacks make up of the prison population. So, this immediately doesn't actually show us bias. But I would caution that, murder is not the only crime people are in prison for. While violent crime is a majority of the reasons why people are serving prison time, it's still not the whole picture. And like I said, the majority of blacks are serving prison time related to drugs. But, again, drug crime is rarely, prosecuted on just a possession charge. There's usually a weapons charge or aggravated assault. There's always something that's attached to those charges. And so we're trying to explain the phenomena, whether this is bias or whether or not what we're observing is other factors within the environment. There's been, obviously, like I said, there's been accusations of racial bias in the U.S. criminal justice system, and there's no doubt that socioeconomic factors have had a heavy pulling effect on kind of what we're observing in the real world. But, again, citing Western and Pettit, we need to exercise some caution. There's very real effects from people's time incarcerated, and that is something that ethically we do have to look at, because when we put a bunch of violent people together with other people who aren't violent, like say your drug offenders and some of the arguments, or people that have committed property crimes, or just innocuous things like they're a thief or whatever, it kind of forces them to change their behavior to survive, and that the creation of these kind of habits certainly could be destructive outside of the prison, and that could lead to reoffense. And so, when we're asking, is prison time ethical? You're definitely got your work ahead of you, but what other choice do we have? We really don't have many options, because if we go with fines, which is the other common form of punishment in the U.S., there's been criticisms that it's criminalization of poverty. So, this issue is pretty complex and it's immensely complicated. There's not one single issue that drives these sort of things. There's just there's many dimensions to this. Another counter argument to the bias is that a lot of police today, departments are using intelligence-led policing, and that's them paying highly paid mathematicians to come up with complex algorithms to help determine where they need to spend these critical resources that are very scarce, paid from the taxpayers. And so another issue that comes up with the intelligence-led police, which again almost kind of contradicts the first point I made, but a lot of neighborhoods are still racially segregated in large metropolitan areas. So the optics of this could explain the perception of bias, but let's also not forget that a majority of police calls are service calls that are related to 911 requests. So I still think the jury is out on determining whether there's specific bias within the U.S. criminal justice system. But to kind of bring this home, and again, stating this for the record, and again, trying to be fair to both sides of this argument, when determining the ethical nature of the system, especially punishment, this criminal justice system is just deeply convoluted and unbelievably complex. Analyzing these things, there are so many different overlays, there's so many different factors, that drive this, from economic, cultural, political. I mean, there's just so many things that go into this, and of course, economic inequality is probably one of the larger drivers of this, because obviously we all know that if you're able to pay for a great legal defense, a lot of times you don't serve as much prison time, or some of your charges get reduced. So, and those are some definitely valid points of discussion. But again, summarizing this up here, guys, appreciate your time, taking a listen in here and taking a look at my infographic. Whether or not I believe that the criminal justice system is currently ethical, I think it's as ethical as it can be. I think the U.S. has dedicated itself to constant improvement, and people paying attention and talking about these issues and raising these issues is what makes these improvements and what continues to shape our system. So, I think at the end of the day, the willingness to talk about and willingness to confront these hard things is what makes our system so great. And obviously the commitment to improvement. So anyways, guys, again, thank you for listening to my project. Hope you enjoyed my infographic, and we'll talk to you later.